The air in the holding cell tasted like copper and something sweetly organic, as if someone had crushed flowers into metal and left them to oxidize. Garrett Hayes sat with his back against the curved wall, feeling the faint pulse of energy that ran through it like a heartbeat. 3 cycles of the alien sun. He'd counted them by the shifting colors that bled through the translucent ceiling above. Violet to amber to deep crimson, then back again. No Earth days here, no familiar rhythm to anchor himself to. His uniform was a wreck. The gray fabric hung in strips across his chest where something, a crystalline blade, maybe, or one of those humming energy whips, had scored it during the ambush. Dust from a world he'd never properly named clung to the tears, russet and fine as powder. He'd stopped trying to brush it off after the first day. What was the point? The guards who brought him water twice per cycle didn't care if he looked presentable for his execution. Execution. The word sat heavy in his mind, but he kept pushing it aside with the same mental trick he'd used during survival training. Catalog everything around you, stay present, don't let fear become panic. The cell was roughly oval, walls smooth and pale green, shot through with luminescent veins that pulsed in slow, steady intervals. Organic architecture, his team's xenobiologist had called it before she died. Before they all died. Before Garrett became the last idiot standing, surrounded by beings who moved like dancers and killed with the casual efficiency of surgeons. He pressed his palms against the floor and felt the subtle warmth radiating up through whatever material it was made from. Not stone, not metal, something grown, perhaps cultivated like the rest of their impossible structures. The ascendancy, they called themselves. He'd picked up fragments of their language during his captivity, enough to understand that much. Ascended to what he couldn't say. Maybe just ascended past the need to explain themselves to primitives like him. The guards were the worst part in a way, not because they were cruel, they weren't particularly. They simply moved through their duties with an unsettling grace. Their elongated ears swept back in smooth curves that made them seem perpetually alert, listening to frequencies he couldn't hear. When they spoke among themselves, their voices lilted and chimed, musical in a way that made his own language feel clumsy and guttural by comparison. One of them had laughed once, a sound like wind through crystal, when he tried to ask where his team had been buried. The guard hadn't been mocking him, Garrett realized later. The concept just struck them as absurd. Why bury what returns to the ecosystem naturally? He'd met their queen during what he could only call a judgment ceremony, though ceremony felt too formal for what had happened. They'd brought him into a chamber so vast he couldn't see the ceiling, surrounded by hundreds of her people, all of them silent and watching with those 2 large eyes. She sat on something between a throne and a living tree, her robes the color of deep water, silver rings adorning her ears in ascending spirals. Young, he'd thought, though age seemed negotiable among her kind. Her face was sharp-featured, beautiful in an angular way that didn't quite map to human aesthetics. When she looked at him, her silver eyes had been utterly neutral, as if he were a specimen under glass. She'd spoken in her own language, her voice carrying without effort through the massive space. He caught maybe 1 word in 5. Outsider, transgression, balance. Then she'd made a gesture with 1 long-fingered hand and he'd been led away. No translator, no defense, no explanation. Just that cold, measured look and the certainty that his fate had been decided. Garrett laughed quietly in the darkness of his cell, the sound harsh against the organic silence. "Well, Hayes," he muttered, "at least you made it to first contact. That's got to count for something on the resume." The absurdity of the thought, as if he'd ever update a resume again, pulled another laugh from him, this one edged with something that might have been hysteria if he let it grow. He didn't. Instead, he rolled his shoulders, feeling the stiffness in muscles that had been idle too long. During his time in the Colonial Marines, his drill sergeant had been a woman named Tors who'd survived 3 separate boarding actions against pirate raiders. She used to say that the body was just a machine and machines needed maintenance. Every day in this cell, he'd run through the exercises she'd drilled into him. Push-ups against the curved wall, squats until his legs shook, shadow boxing in the limited space, throwing punches at imaginary opponents who didn't bleed or fall. The guards had watched him once, their heads tilted in unison like birds observing strange behavior. He'd grinned at them and thrown a particularly aggressive combination, and one of them had made a trilling sound that might have been amusement or pity. Hard to say. Footsteps now, the soft whisper of them approaching down the corridor outside. Multiple sets, moving with that eerie synchronization the ascendancy seemed to prefer. Garrett stood, forcing his breathing to steady, his heart to slow. This was it then. He'd known it was coming, felt it in the way the light had shifted this cycle, how the guards had brought him extra water at the last interval. Small mercies before the end. The door dilated open, actually dilated, the material spiraling outward like an iris, and 3 guards stood silhouetted against the bioluminescent glow of the corridor. They wore armor that looked grown rather than forged, fitted to their bodies in seamless curves, and carried those crystalline staves that hummed with barely contained energy. One of them gestured with a fluid motion that clearly meant come. Garrett walked forward, keeping his head up, his stride even. Tors would have approved. Never let them see you fold, she'd said. Even if you're terrified, even if you know you're outmatched, you walk like you're choosing this. The corridor stretched ahead, curving gently upward, and from somewhere far above came the sound he'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The roar of a crowd, vast and expectant, waiting for whatever spectacle the ascendancy had planned. The sound rolled down through the organic walls like distant thunder, and Garrett felt his jaw tighten. "You know," he said conversationally to the nearest guard, knowing they probably couldn't understand him, "where I'm from, we usually buy a guy dinner before the public execution. Just saying, there's a protocol to these things." The guard's ear twitched slightly, the only indication they'd heard him at all. Garrett smiled despite himself and kept walking toward the light. The light hit him like a physical thing, white and searing after the dim corridors. Garrett squinted against it, his hand rising instinctively to shield his eyes as the guards propelled him forward with gentle but insistent pressure. The roar he'd heard below wasn't distant anymore. It surrounded him, pressed against his eardrums, a living wall of sound that seemed to vibrate through his chest. When his vision adjusted, he understood why they called it an arena, though the word felt inadequate. The structure sprawled before him in a vast oval, carved from stone that wasn't quite stone. Green veins ran through the pale surface like capillaries, pulsing with bioluminescent energy that made the entire space seem alive. The floor beneath his boots felt warm, almost yielding, as if he were walking on the hide of some massive sleeping creature. Tiers of seating rose up and away on all sides, packed with thousands of the ascendancy, their elongated ears creating a strange rippling pattern in the crowd, like a field of wheat moving in wind. Garrett forced himself to breathe, to take it in without letting the sheer scale of it crush him. The sky above was the wrong color, a pale lavender streaked with clouds that moved too quickly, pushed by winds he couldn't feel down here in the arena's sheltered bowl. 2 suns hung at different angles, one amber and bloated, the other small and intensely white. The double shadows they cast made everything look slightly unreal, as if he'd stepped into a painting where the artist couldn't quite decide on a single light source. At the far end of the arena, elevated on a platform that seemed to grow organically from the surrounding stone, sat the throne. He recognized it from the judgment ceremony, that impossible fusion of carved wood and crystalline growths, but seeing it here, framed by open sky and the massed attention of thousands, it carried a different weight. The queen sat there now, her posture upright but not rigid, one hand resting on the arm of the throne while the other lay folded in her lap. Even at this distance, he could make out the silver rings adorning her ears, catching and fracturing the double sunlight into prismatic flares. Around her stood figures in ornate armor, Their breastplates worked with designs that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. Advisors, probably. Generals. The kind of people who made decisions about whether primitives from Earth deserved mercy or just a quick death. From the looks of things, they'd settled on neither. A herald stepped forward on the platform, dressed in robes that shimmered between blue and green depending on how the light caught them. The figure raised both hands, and the crowd noise dropped immediately to silence. Garrett felt his skin prickle at the abruptness of it, thousands of voices cutting off in perfect unison. The herald spoke, voice amplified somehow without any visible technology, words rolling out across the arena in that melodic language he'd been trying and failing to learn. He caught fragments. Outsider, yes. Judgment, that one he knew. Then something that sounded like blood price and another phrase that might have meant demonstration or possibly lesson. His grasp of their language was still crude, built from observation and guesswork. The word that came through clearest, repeated twice, was one he'd heard the guards use when they thought he couldn't hear them. Primitive. The crowd responded with a sound that wasn't quite a cheer, more like a collective exhalation of anticipation. Garrett felt the muscles in his jaw clench and deliberately relaxed them. Getting angry wouldn't help. Getting scared definitely wouldn't help. What would Tors say? Probably something profane and practical. Assess your assets, identify the threat, look for an angle. His assets, 2 hands, 2 feet, a body that was bruised and tired but still functional, and absolutely nothing else. They'd taken his sidearm, his combat knife, even the multi-tool he kept in his boot. He stood in the center of the arena in torn fatigues and standard-issue boots, stripped of everything except his own meat and bone. The threat made itself known as 6 guards emerged from an archway opposite him. They moved in formation, perfectly synchronized, carrying staves that crackled with contained energy. Each staff was about 2 meters long, the surface etched with patterns that glowed a soft amber, and from the way the guards held them, loose but ready, he knew they were both weapon and focus for whatever technology or ability made the ascendancy so dangerous up close. 6 against 1, wonderful odds, really sporting of them. Garrett looked up at the Queen again. She was leaning forward slightly now, elbows on her knees, fingers steepled beneath her chin. Her silver eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that made something twist in his stomach. Not cruelty there, he thought. Curiosity, maybe. The way a scientist might watch a test subject before introducing a variable. Their eyes met across the distance, and he felt the absurdity of the moment crash over him. Here he was, 300 light-years from Earth, about to get his ass handed to him by aliens with magic sticks while an entire civilization watched. If he'd stayed on Mars, taken that mining job like his brother suggested, he'd be complaining about dust storms and shitty recycled air right now. Safe, bored, alive. Instead, he smiled. It felt crooked on his face, half grimace and half genuine amusement at the sheer cosmic joke of his situation. The Queen's head tilted slightly, her ears shifting forward in what might have been surprise. "Well," Garrett said quietly, knowing no one could hear him over the ambient noise of the crowd settling back into a low murmur, "I always did want to die doing something memorable." He rolled his shoulders, feeling vertebrae pop, and shook out his hands. The guards were advancing now, spreading into a loose semicircle to cut off any retreat, not that there was anywhere to retreat to. The arena floor stretched 50 meters in every direction, and the walls were smooth living stone that rose 5 meters before the first tier of seating began. No exits, no weapons, no backup. Just him and 6 trained killers who moved like water. The first guard feinted left, staff humming as it carved through the air. Garrett tracked the movement, weight shifting to his back foot, and felt time do that strange thing it always did in combat, not slowing exactly, but clarifying. Every detail suddenly sharp and relevant. The angle of the guard's shoulders, the slight overextension in the swing, the way the alien's weight committed fractionally too early, Tors had drilled it into him 1,000 times. Fighting wasn't about being stronger or faster. It was about being willing to take damage while you found the opening, about reading intent in the microseconds before action, about being too stupid or too stubborn to quit when quitting was the rational choice. The staff crackled past his ear close enough to feel the static discharge raise the hair on his neck. Garrett didn't think. He drove forward inside the guard's reach and buried his elbow in what he hoped was a vulnerable spot just below the alien's ribcage. The guard made a sound, sharp, surprised, and stumbled backward. The crowd gasped. Garrett grinned, tasting blood in his mouth from where he'd bitten his cheek, and thought, okay, round one to the primitive. Then the other 5 guards moved, and everything became motion and violence and the desperate mathematics of survival. The second guard came in high, staff sweeping toward his skull with enough force that Garrett heard the air split before he saw the movement. He dropped, knees hitting the warm stone hard enough to send jolts of pain up his thighs, and felt the weapon pass through the space his head had occupied a fraction of a second earlier. The crackle of energy left an ozone taste on his tongue, sharp and metallic. No time to appreciate not being dead. A third guard lunged from his right, staff thrust forward like a spear. Garrett twisted, the weapon grazing his ribs and tearing through what remained of his uniform. The impact, even glancing, felt like touching a live wire, muscles seizing for an instant before his nervous system remembered how to function. He used the momentum of his spin, came up on one leg, and drove his boot into the third guard's knee. The joint bent wrong. The alien went down with a trill of pain that sounded disturbingly musical, and Garrett didn't wait to see if the damage would stick. He was already moving, already looking for the next threat because standing still meant dying, and he'd had enough lectures from Tors about the importance of mobility to last 3 lifetimes. "Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth, dancing backward as 2 more guards coordinated their approach. "Let's make this interesting." They obliged. The guards moved like they'd trained together for years, which they probably had. One went low while the other struck high, a pincer attack designed to eliminate escape routes. Garrett saw it forming, saw the trap close around him, and did the only thing that made sense in a situation with no good options. He charged directly at the lower guard. The alien's eyes widened, those too large, too aware eyes, and Garrett crashed into them shoulder first. They went down in a tangle of limbs, the guard's staff clattering away across the stone. Garrett grabbed for it, fingers closing around the shaft, and immediately regretted every decision that had led to this moment. The weapon felt alive in his hands, vibrating with contained energy that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. Wrong species, wrong biology, wrong everything. The staff didn't want to be held by him. He threw it anyway, not at the guards but up and away, a wild heave that sent the weapon spinning end over end toward the crowd. Let them scramble for it. Let them remember that humans were unpredictable and stupid, and sometimes that was its own kind of advantage. A staff caught him across the back, and the world went white with pain. His nervous system shorted out, legs giving way, and he hit the ground face first. The taste of blood filled his mouth, real this time, not bitten cheek but split lip and possibly a loosened tooth. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard the crowd make that collective sound again, anticipation mixed with something else. Confusion, maybe. This wasn't going how they expected. Good. Garrett rolled, ignoring the screaming protests from his back muscles, and came up swinging. His fist connected with a guard's midsection. Then his other hand found what might have been a throat or possibly just a vulnerable stretch of neck. The alien made a choking sound and staggered. Not down, but rattled. He'd rattled them. A boot. His boot, standard colonial marine issue, designed for low-gravity environments and apparently also for kicking alien warriors, found purchase against another guard's chest plate. The impact jarred his knee, sent pain lancing up his leg, but the guard flew backward with enough force to crash into a companion. Both went down in a clatter of armor and crystalline weapons, 4 down or at least disrupted. 2 still standing and circling him with new caution in their movements. The one with the possibly damaged throat had retrieved their staff and held it in a guard position, watching him with those silver eyes narrowed in concentration. The other guard, younger maybe or just less experienced, kept glancing toward the throne as if looking for guidance. Garrett spat blood onto the stone and watched it sizzle slightly where it landed. Apparently, human blood and alien architecture didn't play well together. He filed that information away under things that might matter if I survive this, and addressed the guards in front of him. You know what your problem is. He circled right, forcing them to adjust their positioning. His back was on fire, his ribs felt cracked, and he was pretty sure something in his left hand was broken from that last punch. But he was still standing, still moving, and that seemed to bother them more than the actual damage he'd inflicted. You fight pretty, all synchronized and elegant, very impressive at parties, I bet. The older guard said something in their language, sharp and commanding. The younger one responded, uncertainty clear in their tone even if Garrett couldn't parse the words. Here's the thing about humans, Garrett continued, knowing they couldn't understand him but finding comfort in the sound of his own voice. In the ritual of he feinted left and both guards reacted, staffs coming up in perfect defensive form. Beautiful technique, textbook response. Completely wrong for dealing with someone who'd learned to brawl in the recycling districts of Mars, where the only rule was that there were no rules. Garrett went right instead, closing the distance before they could adjust. He grabbed the younger guard's staff with both hands, felt that awful vibration again, felt his muscles start to seize, and instead of fighting it, he pulled. Yanked hard, using the guard's own grip against them, and the alien stumbled forward. Garrett's forehead met their face in a brutal headbutt that made stars explode across his vision, but did significantly worse to the guard's delicate features. The guard dropped, and Garrett had their staff. It fought him, the weapon actively resisting his touch through some mechanism he didn't understand, but he held on through sheer spite and swung it like a baseball bat at the remaining standing guard. The two staffs met with a sound like breaking glass, and both weapons shattered in sprays of crystalline fragments that caught the double sunlight and fell like strange snow across the arena floor. Silence crashed over the space. Complete, profound, broken only by Garrett's ragged breathing and the groans of the guards he'd put down. He stood in the center of the arena, hands empty again, bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts where crystal shrapnel had found skin. His back was a symphony of agony. His face hurt, everything hurt, but he was standing. The guards on the ground were stirring, trying to rise, but they moved slowly now, uncertain. One clutched their wrist at an angle that suggested something broken. Another couldn't seem to put weight on the knee Garrett had kicked. The one he'd headbutted was sitting on the stone, hands pressed to their face, making a keening sound that might have been pain or shock or both. Garrett looked up at the throne through eyes that were starting to swell. The queen was on her feet now, both hands gripping the arms of her seat, her entire posture radiating something he couldn't quite read. Behind her, the advisors and generals were talking urgently among themselves, their earlier composure cracked. He raised one hand, his right, the one that wasn't broken, and gave a small, almost apologetic wave. "So," he called out, voice rough and carrying across the shocked silence, "do I pass, or do we go another round? Because I gotta tell you, my dance card's getting pretty full." The queen descended the platform with movements that reminded Garrett of water flowing downhill, inevitable and graceful. Her robes caught the double sunlight and shifted between deep blue and something close to black, and the silver rings in her ears chimed softly with each step. The crowd remained locked in that profound silence, thousands of beings holding their breath as one. Garrett stayed where he was, swaying slightly on his feet. Running wasn't an option. His legs were about done, and besides, where would he go? He'd made his statement, whatever that statement was worth. If she wanted him dead now, at least he'd go out having shocked the hell out of everyone present. Small victories. The queen reached the arena floor and walked toward him, alone. Her advisors had moved to follow, but she'd raised one hand without looking back and they'd frozen. A woman used to being obeyed then. Garrett could respect that. Tors had been the same way, commanding authority without needing to shout for it. She stopped 3 paces away, close enough that he could see the fine details of her face. Not young, he realized now. Ageless was more accurate, her features carrying that quality of someone who'd lived long enough that time had stopped marking them in conventional ways. Her eyes were the pale silver of Mercury, and they studied him with an intensity that made him want to fidget. He resisted the urge. "You fight," she said in his language, her accent strange but comprehensible, with no grace. Garrett blinked. Of all the things he'd expected her to say that hadn't made the list, he coughed, tasted blood, and managed a rough laugh. "Yeah, well, grace doesn't win fights where I'm from. Stubbornness and a willingness to take hits does." Her head tilted, ears shifting forward in what he'd learned to recognize as focused attention. "Your people teach this, to endure damage for the chance to inflict it." "My people teach survival," he said. "We're not the strongest or the fastest. Hell, we're not even close to the smartest, no matter what we tell ourselves. But we're really, really good at not staying down when someone puts us there." One of the guards groaned behind him, and the queen's eyes flicked past Garrett to assess the damage. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. Not quite approval, but definitely not disapproval either. More like a scientist revising a hypothesis in real time. "The ritual," she said, bringing her attention back to him, "requires judgment through combat. You are meant to accept your death with dignity." "Yeah, I got that impression." Garrett wiped blood from his lip with the back of his hand. "Here's the thing, though. Humans are really bad at accepting things we don't agree with. Dignity's great and all, but living's better. You thought you could live against 6 trained warriors?" "Honestly, no." He grinned despite the pain it caused. "But I figured if I was going out, I'd make it memorable. Give you folks something to talk about at dinner parties. Remember that primitive who didn't have the sense to die quietly? That guy was me." The queen's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough to surprise him. She turned then, looking back at her throne and the assembled masses beyond. When she spoke, her voice carried across the arena without apparent effort, amplified by some technology or ability he still didn't understand. She spoke in her own language, long flowing sentences that rose and fell with musical cadence. The crowd listened in absolute silence. Garrett caught fragments, the word for outsider again, and something that might have meant strength or possibly will. Another phrase that sounded like new understanding, and then a word he'd heard guards use when discussing their own people: worthy. The queen turned back to him, and her expression had changed. Not warm exactly, but no longer quite so remote. "You are not prey," she said in his language, each word deliberate. "Prey accepts the hunt. You refused the role we gave you." "Yeah, well." Garrett shrugged, immediately regretted it as his back screamed in protest. "Where I'm from, we've got a saying. Something about it being better to die on your feet than live on your knees. Course, I'm not actually dead yet, so that's a bonus." "You will not die today." The queen said it as fact, not offer. "Your people, humans you call yourselves. You have shown something my people believed impossible. You have no enhancement, no connection to the energies that flow through living things, no refinement of form. And yet you stood against warriors who have trained since childhood in the sacred arts. If it helps, I trained too, just differently." He thought of Tors, of the drills she'd run them through in the training bay of the transport ship, of the countless hours learning to fall, to roll, to turn an opponent's strength into weakness. "We might not have your fancy energy weapons or your—" He gestured vaguely at the living architecture around them, tree powers or whatever. "But we've got about 10,000 years of figuring out how to hurt each other with our bare hands. You pick things up." One of her advisors had approached now. An older male with elaborate armor and ears, adorned with enough silver to fund a small colony. He spoke urgently in their language, gesturing at Garrett with what looked like concern or possibly disgust. Hard to read. The Queen listened, then responded with a single sharp phrase that made the advisor step back. She looked at Garrett again, and this time there was definitely amusement in those mercury eyes. "My council believes you are dangerous," she said. "That your kind should be quarantined or studied from a safe distance." "Your council's not wrong," Garrett admitted. "Humans are pretty dangerous. We've got a bad habit of spreading everywhere and breaking things we don't understand. But here's the thing, we also make friends really easily. We adopt alien pets, learn alien languages, try alien food even when it probably shouldn't be food. We're curious and stubborn and generally terrible at staying in our own corner of space." Is this meant to reassure me? "Not really, no. Just being honest." He met her eyes directly, refusing to look away first even though every instinct screamed that challenging a queen was a bad idea. "But we remember people who treat us with respect. And we really remember people who give us a fair shot when we don't deserve one." The Queen was quiet for a long moment, studying him with that unnerving intensity. Then, slowly and deliberately, she inclined her head. Not a bow of submission, her posture made that clear, but an acknowledgement, recognition between equals or at least between beings who'd surprised each other. The crowd erupted, not in anger or outrage, but in a sound that might have been approval or simply shock. The noise washed over the arena like a wave, and Garrett felt his knees finally give out. He sat down hard on the warm stone, breathing heavily, and started to laugh. "Something amuses you?" the Queen asked. "Just thinking," he managed between gasps, "about the report I'm gonna have to file. First contact protocol violation. Started a diplomatic incident by refusing to die properly. My superiors are gonna love that." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face into something almost human. "Perhaps," she said, "your superiors will understand that sometimes the most important bridges are built through unexpected means." Guards approached, different ones, wearing armor marked with symbols that suggested medical training. They moved carefully around him, clearly uncertain how to proceed with treating a human's injuries. The Queen spoke to them in rapid, commanding tones, and they nodded, producing devices that hummed with soft blue light. As they worked, numbing the worst of his pain and sealing cuts with what looked like spray-on skin, Garrett looked up at the double suns and thought about tours, about his dead team, about the improbable series of events that had led to this moment. Sitting in an alien arena while a queen who'd meant to execute him now stood watch over his treatment like he was something valuable instead of something disposable. The Queen crouched down beside him, graceful even in that undignified position. "You will remain with us," she said, "not as prisoner, as—" she searched for the word, "as teacher, perhaps. My people need to understand yours better, and you have shown us something we did not expect to find. Strength without enhancement, will without connection to the greater flows." "I'm not really qualified to represent humanity," Garrett protested. "I'm just one guy who got lucky." "Luck," she repeated, tasting the word. "We do not have this concept in our language. But I think I understand it now, seeing you. And perhaps that is what we need most, to learn from those who trust in luck rather than certainty." In the tiers above, the crowd had begun to disperse, moving in flowing groups toward the exits. But many remained, watching, discussing what they'd witnessed in animated tones that carried down to the arena floor. Garrett could feel the weight of their attention, knew that what had happened here would spread. The human who fought with nothing. The primitive who refused to die. Whatever they called him, it would travel through the ascendancy like ripples in water. He looked at the Queen and saw her watching him with that mercury gaze, patient and curious, and no longer quite so alien. "Guess I'm staying then," he said. "Fair warning, humans are terrible house guests. We eat weird things and make too much noise and ask uncomfortable questions." "I suspect," the Queen said, rising fluidly to her feet and offering